Hello everyone, come back TV spoilers. Reveal that Nikki stepped into this war thinking she could pull everything back into line. But the harder she tried to restore order, the more she became the spark that made the whole city combustible. In Genoa City, some battles don't begin with gunshots, they begin with a look that turns to ice. A phone call cut short, a contract signed in silence, and promises that sound sweet but tighten like a noose. Nikki understood that better than anyone because she had spent a lifetime inside Victor's orbit, believing love and loyalty could become a shield strong enough to protect her from any incoming blow. This time, though, what cracked her open wasn't an enemy outside her marriage. It was the terrifying sense that she was standing between two worlds inside, anchored to the husband she once saw as an unmovable pillar, the other tied to Jack. The friend she couldn't deny had been her lifeline in her darkest hours. That collision crushed her beneath a question she could no longer avoid: who was she now? If her choices made Victor see her as a traitor, and her silence turned Jack into the next casualty of Victor's revenge, everything began slipping off the rails the moment Nikki could no longer stomach the way Victor turned hatred into a lifestyle. His attack on Jabot wasn't simply a business strike. To Victor, it was a personal manifesto, a way to remind the entire town that Newman would never bow to Abbott. In that climate, the artificial intelligence program became the most dangerous weapon of all, not only because it could shift markets and cripple an empire, but because it hinted at something colder: the ability to control people through data, to replace trust and instinct with models that could manipulate outcomes. Nikki didn't see that threat as theory. She felt it in her bones because she had watched Victor use every tool available to win. She knew that if he didn't stop, this wouldn't end at Jabot. The war would spill into everything that touched Jack, everything that touched Diane, everything that seemed unrelated but was always within Victor's reach. And the most frightening part was how easily Victor could convince himself he was doing it for family, for legacy, for what was right, when the truth was that it was obsession dressed in honor. That was why Nikki reached for a decision that felt both desperate and reckless. She threatened divorce if Victor didn't hand over the AI program and stop the assault on Jabot. To outsiders, it might have looked like a shocking rebellion from a woman long accustomed to living under her husband's power. For Nikki, it was the last boundary she could set to keep herself from being dragged into the abyss with him. She didn't issue that threat to defeat Victor. She issued it to save what remained of her own humanity. Inside this marriage, Jabot forced Victor to see that some victories cost more than he wanted to admit. The moment she said it, pain spread through her like a crack in the center of her chest, because she knew she was touching what Victor hated most: defiance. Victor could tolerate setbacks in business. He could not tolerate the woman he loved placing conditions on his power. In Victor's eyes, Nikki's ultimatum wasn't resistance. It was betrayal. And the closer Nikki came to that line, the more she realized she was holding secrets that mattered: Newman's secrets. Not just information but leverage. Keys that could open the door to a real and catastrophic collapse. Those secrets didn't appear out of nowhere, they were the product of years beside Victor. Hearing enough to understand, seeing enough to predict, and often staying quiet long enough that people assumed she knew nothing at all. That silence had once helped keep the Newman world standing through storms. Now it terrified her because it meant she could ruin them if she chose wrong. If she stood with Jack, one misstep could shove Newman into a dead end, not because Jack was strong enough to destroy them alone, but because the family would fracture the instant Victor realized the person closest to him had a blade pressed against his legacy. Nikki didn't want to be the match that lit the fire, but the more she tried to avoid it, the more Victor's machinery pulled her in. In the days that followed, Nikki slipped into a confusion so intense she barely recognized her own thoughts. Part of her insisted that if she tried hard enough, if she explained it the right way, Victor would stop. She reminded herself that she had pulled Victor back from the edge before, that love could still soften a man forged from ambition and control. But every time she saw Victor's eyes harden at Jack's name, she realized this hatred wasn't temporary. It was foundational. To Victor, Jack wasn't merely a rival, Jack was a lifelong symbol of defiance. The thorn that forced Victor to prove himself again and again. Nikki understood a brutal truth: no speech she gave could dismantle hatred this deep. She could talk about loyalty, about family, about moral limits, about the damage this war would do to Victor. It would always sound like noise in the way of victory. Then the cruel irony struck, and it shook Nikki even more. Victor didn't answer her rebellion with the fury she expected. Instead, he reached for sweetness, tender words, softened gestures. Moments designed to remind Nikki why she had loved him in the first place. It was the most dangerous kind of softness because it didn't force her with strength. It trapped her with memory. Victor didn't make Nikki forget her anger because he had changed. He made her forget because he knew exactly where to touch to make her waver. Nikki hated that it worked, hated the feeling of being guided like a move on a chessboard. But she also couldn't deny the ache inside her, the part of her that still wanted to believe Victor could return to the man she once chose. And that was what made her furious with herself. Because if she softened now, she wouldn't just be betraying Jack. She would be betraying the boundaries she had set to protect her own soul. Pulled between anger and memory, Nikki found herself returning to Jacknet as a clean break from Victor. But as an emotional truth she could not sever the way Victor demanded. She clung to that friendship like a rare safe place in a city built on power plays. But the harder she tried to protect it, the more that safe place turned into a battlefield. Nikki understood that Jack was one of the few people who could still see her as Nikki, not as Mrs. Newman, not as Victor's shadow, not as a queen locked inside a gilded cage. With Jack, she had once felt allowed to be fragile without being punished for it. That alone was enough to fuel Victor's rage. Because it proved Jack possessed something Victor could not buy or command. Understanding without control. Nikki didn't pretend she had an easy path. She still wanted to convince Victor to abandon his darkest plans. But Jack already knew her efforts would fail. He didn't need to say it aloud for Nikki to feel it. Sometimes the way Jack looked at her, sympathy mixed with helplessness, made her feel like someone trying to stop a flood with bare hands. Jack had known Victor too long to believe pleading would matter. Victor stopped only when the cost outweighed the reward, and in wars like this, Victor nearly always believed any price was worth paying if it bought him a win. Jack could see Nikki trying to do the right thing, but he could also see the trap closing. The more Nikki stood in the middle, the more she became a target. Victor wouldn't only strike Jabot. He would strike whatever made Nikki dare to step out of the Newman orbit, and that, inevitably, meant Jack. The tension rose not like an explosion but like suffocation. Nikki began to feel weight in every room she entered, as if the air itself was being controlled. Every conversation that touched Victor carried long pauses, unfinished thoughts, and fear of being overheard by the very machinery of Newman power. Nikki understood that in this war, no one was truly safe, not even her. Being Victor's wife no longer meant she was untouchable. If anything, it made her the weakness that could be exploited. The door Victor wanted both locked and weaponized. The more Nikki thought about the secrets she held, the more she feared the day Victor forced her to choose total loyalty or total destruction. And what terrified her most was that she wasn't sure she had the strength to survive a direct war against the man she had once sworn to stand beside. She began to grasp the cruel paradox at the heart of it all. The more she tried to protect Jack, the more Victor treated her like the enemy. And the more Victor treated her like the enemy, the more she had to live like someone walking on thin ice, terrified that one crack would drop her into freezing water. Nikki didn't want to be the reason Newman ended in a deadlock, but she also couldn't watch Victor destroy Jabot purely to satisfy a personal vendetta. To Nikki, Victor's campaign wasn't just about a company. It was about the principle that power could do anything without consequence. Nikki had lived too long inside that principle to pretend it wasn't poisonous. And that was why, even when she appeared to settle back beside Victor, there was still a voice inside her that wouldn't stop whispering, if you give up this time, you won't get a second chance to save yourself. But no storm like this can stretch on without consequences. Nikki had fought to keep her friendship with Jack alive up to now. Yet she could feel it approaching the edge of extinction. Not because Nikki wanted to cut it off, but because everything around her was tightening. Victor would never accept a presence that made him feel challenged. Jack could not remain a punching bag forever, taking hit after hit because Nikki's courage had to stay hidden in silence. And Nikki'd woman trapped between them could not keep both her marriage and her friendship intact, without making one side bleed. That was the sharpest pain of all. She could already see the ending. But she kept fighting it anyway, as if persistence alone could change fate. All of it fed the sense that a major turning point was waiting ahead, like a locked door that would finally burst open in 2026. Nikki didn't know whether that turning point would come from Victor, or from the breaking point of her own endurance. She only knew that as the new year approached, the things that seemed stable would begin to shake. The secrets she carried would no longer remain quiet burdens. They would demand to be named, to be used, or to be buried forever. And once Nikki was forced into the moment of decision, she wouldn't be able to choose the safe path anymore because safe in this world was often just a beautiful cage built to disguise the truth that you surrendered your freedom a long time ago. Nikki looked at Victor and realized he wasn't only attacking Jack, He was attacking the part of Nikki that still wanted to believe in something better. Nikki looked at Jack and realized that friendship wasn't merely nostalgia. It was proof that she could still be different. Still stand on the side of what felt right without asking anyone for permission. But the more clearly she saw both truths, the more obvious it became that they could not exist together forever. And just when Nikki thought she could keep balancing a little longer, the pressure thickened like the whole city was holding its breath, waiting for her to fall. 2026 was coming like a blade hanging overhead. And Nikki understood that soon Victor wouldn't simply ask whose side she was on, would demand she prove it. And Jack, even without issuing an ultimatum, would reach his limit once he could no longer be the target Nikki protected in silence. When that limit was finally crossed, Nikki would face a single, brutal choice: use Newman's own secrets to stop Victor, or let Jack go to preserve a marriage already rotting from the inside. But the most chilling truth Nikki had not yet allowed herself to name was this: what if the turning point of 2026 didn't begin with a noose strike against Jabot at all, but with the moment Victor turned and looked straight at her, as if he had finally understood that the most dangerous enemy of Newman wasn't Abbott. It was the woman standing inside the Newman house. Let's start with the clue. Josh Griffith dropped it thin as a needle, but sharp enough to slice straight through the familiar surface of the Newman versus Abbott war. If Nikki has long been seen as the woman caught in the middle, Victor's wife, yet still bound to Jack by a history that never fully dissolved, then this hint shifts the color of everything in a far more unsettling way. Nikki is no longer just the person trying to calm the battlefield. She may be getting pushed into an active role, as if she has truly entered the mission, not merely reacting to Victor's choices but becoming part of the machinery that brings Jack down. And that is precisely where the danger multiplies. Because the moment Nikki is positioned at the center of a mission like this, the fallout stops being abstract. It becomes personal, immediate, and unavoidable, collision directly with Jack and Diane. To people already fighting to hold their balance between love, reputation, and the fractures that this generational feud creates again and again. If Nikki joins in the way Griffith implies, the story stops being a duel between two powerful men and becomes something sharper. A collision in which private relationships are turned into weapons. Loyalty is ripped open and thrown onto the table like a disposable card. And the cost is measured in trust rather than money. From that point on, the consequences Victor and Nikki unleash on Jack and Diane can't be treated as a symbolic slap or a strategic warning shot. The stakes are framed as serious in the truest sense. Any move aimed at Jack right now has the potential to undermine the structure he relies on to steady Jabot, to steady his name, and more importantly, to steady his personal life. Diane Woe has already fought through too many layers of suspicion and judgment just to stand beside Jack as a legitimate part of his future would feel the coldest edge of this attack first. Because every shock that hits Jack also drags Diane toward the place she hates most. The position of the woman people blame, the woman people doubt, the woman opponents treat as the easiest pressure point. And what makes it worse is the rhythm of it all. The threat isn't just that a blow is calming, it's that it arrives with a speed and timing that keeps Jack off balance. As if he misses a beat in a chess match, Victor has already plotted several moves ahead. And this time Nikki becomes the variable that changes the angle of every piece on the board. Jack might have believed that, at minimum, Nikki still recognized moral boundaries, or that some remnant of old loyalty would prevent her from going too far. But that assumption becomes the weakness. The most devastating attack isn't when your enemy is stronger than you, it's when the enemy appears in the place you believed was impossible. That's why the idea of Victor and Nikki both working to bring Jack down instantly carries a different weight than any conflict that came before. If it were only Victor, Jack could brace himself. Because Victor's rage and vengeance have always been predictable in one way: relentless. Victor is the kind of man who would burn the sky just to prove he can. But if Nikki stands on that same line, the pressure becomes a chokehold from both sides. One side is Victor's raw, uncompromising power, and the other is a precise cut delivered by someone Jack once believed would never choose to become his executioner, without any dramatic declaration. The combination itself is a statement. This is no longer the public Newman versus Abbott war that plays out in boardrooms and headlines. This is a campaign designed to break Jack's internal system of trust, forcing him to reevaluate everything he thought he understood about Nikki, about Victor, and about his own ability to read the game. And when Jack is shoved into a position where he can't react fast enough, the unexpected consequences aren't just financial or strategic losses. They become psychological damage, a destabilizing sensation that he can't see the real picture anymore, that the story he's been living is not the story unfolding in front of him. Historically, Nikki has been the person who tries to minimize the damage, even when she loves Victor. She has always carried the instinct to pull him back toward the line of what is still acceptable, to soften his cruelty before it bleeds into the lives of people she doesn't want destroyed. That's exactly why the possibility of Nikki turning on Jack and even taking proactive steps to harm him lands like a shockwave. It's the kind of reversal Griffith excels at. The roles flip, the motives get reframed, and viewers are forced to ask what Nikki is truly doing, what she truly believes, and who she is becoming inside this storm of power. The fear here isn't that Nikki simply switches sides. It's that the switch can be packaged as something painfully logical, deeply convincing, and unmistakably Newman: loyalty, family, legacy, old vows, and the terror of losing everything. When someone who once functioned as a brake becomes a blade, it means either they have been pushed past their limiter, they've been persuaded that softness equals surrender. And this is where Victor enters with the instinct he has never lost. Victor changes Nikki's plan, not with obvious brute force, but with the technique Victor uses best: turning loyalty into identity, turning family into moral justification, turning standing with Newman into the only choice that qualifies as survival. Victor wouldn't be pleased simply because he gains an ally. He would be thrilled because Nikki's allegiance is symbolic in the most absolute way. It's not just manpower, it's proof. It's Victor declaring that Newman doesn't only overpower Abbott in business, but conquers Abbott at the most vulnerable emotional point, because Jack once believed Nikki would always remain something Victor could not fully control. If Nikki truly displays total loyalty to the Newman name and becomes part of Victor's team, in this war against the Abbotts, it becomes a strike that is both cold and intimate. It turns the conflict into a story of possession. Victor doesn't only want to beat Jack. He wants to prove Jack can't keep anything that belongs to Newman: no influence, no history, not even the emotional bond Jack thought was untouchable. In this tightening atmosphere, Nikki can step into a new role that feels chilling precisely because it doesn't require her to become someone completely different. It only requires the darker pieces that have always existed inside her: pride, sharpened by years of living in Victor's shadow, fear of being viewed as weak, the hunger to belong to a side that doesn't question her loyalty to rise to the surface. If Victor convinces Nikki that choosing him equals choosing family, choosing legacy, choosing the survival of the Newman name, Nikki can start seeing Jack not as a friend or a relic of her past, but as a dangerous variable, something that once felt safe, but now threatens the stability she cannot afford to lose. The moment Nikki allows herself to view Jack through that lens, the slide into full conflict becomes almost inevitable. Jack stops being the man who once rescued her from her darkest nights. He becomes the enemy in a war Nikki has been persuaded she cannot lose without losing herself. In other words, as this storyline intensifies, the most gripping question isn't merely how Victor will strike Jack, but how Nikki will do it without collapsing under the weight of what she is becoming. Nikki has never wanted to call herself a traitor. If she becomes proactive in harming Jack, she will need a system of reasoning strong enough to keep her from drowning in guilt. And Victor is the kind of man who can build that system for her. Jack has always been Newman's rival. Jack will always pull you away from your family. Jack will always make the world label you as Abbott even when you carry the Newman name. Repeated often enough, those ideas become emotional truth. And once Nikki clings to emotional truth, she can travel farther than Jack ever believed possible. That's where the tension becomes suffocating. Because if Nikki stands beside Victor and treats Jack as an enemy, Jack will be forced to fight not only Victor's power, but the brutal realization that what he believed about Nikki may have been an illusion all along. Diane will feel the danger most sharply, because she understands how the new Manabot war punishes people through indirect strikes. Each step Nikki takes toward Victor will make Diane feel the ground under her crack a little more. Because Victor never hits once. He hits in sequences. He hits to break willpower. He hits until someone starts doubting their own reality. And if Nikki is truly on Victor's team, the sequence becomes even more unpredictable. Because Nikki understands Jack in ways Victor never will. And she understands Diane in ways Victor has always wanted Tobit never earned. That understanding, turned into a weapon, is what could leave Jack exactly where you described, not merely attacked, but attacked at the points he never thought Nikki would touch. At that stage, the story stops being about who wins and who loses. It becomes a story about how loyalty mutates, how a power war can reshape someone like Nikki, and how ruthless Victor becomes when he believes his wife has finally chosen the Newman side, without reservation. If Victor is thrilled by Nikki's total loyalty, that excitement is itself a warning sign. Once Victor believes all doubt has been erased, he will strike harder, more openly, with fewer masks. And then Jack won't just need to counterattack. He will need to survive a war, where Nikki may be the one helping Victor choose the most precise timing. and the most devastating target. And that's why the pressure is building toward the moment viewers crave, the moment Jack realizes he misread the board, the moment Diane realizes serious consequences are no longer a vague threat but an oncoming reality, and the moment Nikki realizes that once she crosses the line and calls Jack her enemy, there is no path back that doesn't demand a payment from her soul. But the most haunting question still waits ahead. In the darker territory Griffith seems to be steering toward, what will Nikki do to prove her loyalty? And what kind of proof will Victor demand to make sure she has no retreat left? Will Jack see the next blow in time? Or will he be taken down in the very moment he still believes Nikki could never go that far? And if Nikki truly becomes Victor's strongest card in the war against the Abbotts, will the 2026 turn begin with a strike against Jabot? Or with a strike against the last piece of faith Jack still has left in Nikki? Our TV Spoilers channel is always looking for content inspiration for each video. By compiling short video clips to analyze and offer personal opinions, this channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting insights. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.